In this next portion of the winter growers meeting for the Dry Farming Collaborative, we're going to talk about dry bean variety trials that we did last year. I'm Lucas Niebert, who led the project, and we trialed two different species. On the left, we have the Phaseolus acutifolius, or Peppery Beans, which is a different species than our common bean, Phaseolus vulgaris, on the right. And yeah, as you can see, we had several different varieties from each species. First, a little more background on the Peppery beans. They're native to southwestern United States, northern Mexico region, and they're considered to be drought tolerant. They are high in fiber and protein and have good storage properties, and are considered a good animal forage crop. Interestingly, in our trials, we also have a cross between Peppery beans and common beans. This cross was done under the guidance of Jim Myers, OSU Department of Horticulture, and it's not a natural process. It was achieved through embryo rescue, and after that first cross, it was back crossed with the common bean, so it definitely resembles a common bean, but it has some of the beneficial properties of Peppery beans, including storage and storage benefits and anti-pest proteins. And there was three particular accessions that were drought tolerant, which we're calling JM1, JM2, and JM3. One thing to note about this variety is they have a relatively upright plant architecture, so it's good for in-field threshing. The other breeding material that we have in our dry farm bean variety trials was selections done by Amy Garrett from the Beefy Resilient Grex, which is a variety from Carol Deppy, Furrow Valley Seeds. It's open source seed initiative pledged. And it's an intentionally diverse population. There's indeterminate bush bean that is a cross between gaucho and black mitla, which is popularly regarded as a Peppery, but it is actually just a common bean species. And what Amy did was just made some single plant selections, and we've been evaluating them and selecting them further. These selections were made of well-performing plants in dry farm conditions. And as an indeterminate, it keeps on growing if you water it. It has a slight runner habit, and indeterminate varieties seem to do pretty well dry farmed. In addition to those breeding materials we were evaluating, we also included some commercially available bean varieties. We have Rockwell and Whipple, which we had been growing for the last couple of years, the Dry Farming Collaborative, and we wanted to grow them again. And they're from Uprising Seeds and Adaptive Seeds, respectively. And then from Uprising Seeds, we also wanted to trial some very outstanding varieties: Rosa de Luca, Marfex, Zolfino, and Hungarian rice bean. There's no real reason to think that they would do well dry farms, but we wanted to see how they go because they're very excellent bean varieties. In addition, we have the Peppery bean panel here, and they are from different sources. The Sacaton Brown on the bottom left, we can find has been grown by Adaptive Seeds for a few years. And so we can find that locally in Oregon, the Willamette Valley. And then also we have the blue speckled Peppery, which is relatively common, probably the most common commercially available bean, but it was hard to come by during the pandemic last year while everyone is was ordering many seeds for their gardens. And then also commercially available is a black Peppery bean called PT082 from Native Seed Search. In addition, we have other accessions that were and are being bred by Tim Porch, USDA, ARS. Those are all the so-called TEP numbers. And then the Richard Pratt, he from University of New Mexico, provided us with some beans from Maricopa County, and Chiapas from Mexico, which is not pictured here. And the TEP 22, this white Peppery bean, the blue speckled Peppery bean, and Sacaton brown, we had enough seed for that, so they're all in our SeedLink variety trial that we conducted last year. And we had 12 participants in the SeedLink variety trial. It was the first year trying this. And just as a sample of the performance of the beans, we had for vigor, we had 6 trial results. Blue speckled Peppery having the lowest vigor, and Sacaton brown having the highest plant vigor. And we also took quantitative data, and we can see if this quantitative data fits with our grower evaluations. So we took some quantitative data on a couple sites owned by OSU, the Vegetable Research Farm, and the Lewis Brown Farm. And the common beans were dry farmed and irrigated, and the Peppery beans were just dry farmed. Each replicate plot was just a single 20-foot row at 6-inch spacing, and they were planted in the first week of June. So here's their germination rate or emergence rate across the sites, and they're colored by the bean color. So the germination rates of common beans were on average slightly higher than Peppery beans. Peppery beans in general, I think one of their biggest constraints of being grown this far north is they're not very cool weather tolerant, particularly in germination. So this will be an important trait to select for as Peppery beans are used more in our region. And we can see that in general, the germination rate was relatively low this year. We had some issues with pest pressure, including cucumber beetle larvae. And one thing to note was, our qualitative SeedLink data mirrored our quantitative data. In this case, we have the blue speckled Peppery near the bottom, the white Peppery in the middle, and then Sacaton brown Peppery further up. So that goes to show that you don't have to necessarily count plants, and you can crowdsource data from farmers. Here's just a snapshot comparison of dry farm versus irrigated common bean plots at Lewis Brown Farm in early August. And the one thing to note is the weed pressure is a lot less in dry farming, and it's easier to get in between the rows and look at the plants. So that's one benefit with dry farming. Here's the same dry farm plot during the wildfire smoke in early September, and that delayed harvest and delayed plant maturity a little bit this last year. It was about a week of intense smoke. Here's a couple shots of the Peppery beans plots, one in early August and the other in early September. the Peppery Beans, they're kind of more bush-like. They have vining and twining properties a little more, and they present their beans on the underside of the plants to protect them from the heat. So we have, I divide out the earliness of the maturity for common and Peppery beans into 3 basic categories. You can see that nearly all Pepperies matured within 90 to 100 days. And in terms of common beans, the beefy resilient number 4, this black beefy resilient Grex, was the earliest. And then following that, we had our other last Peppery, the black Peppery from Native Seed Search. We have, finishing with that, was Marfax, this determinate bean variety from Uprising Seeds. And then after that, we had Rockwell, Rosta de Luca, and beefy resilient brown beans. And then in the next category, we have Whipple, maturing a little before Jim Meyer's interspecies crosses, numbers 1 through 3. And then Hungarian rice and Zolfino finished last. One thing to note was the irrigated beans took longer to mature than the dry farm beans, up to a week. And dry farm beans were less prone to mold, and they're easier to thresh due to less leaf vegetative biomass in the way. Getting into yield results, we have them organized from lowest to highest dry farm yield in the red. And then we also have the irrigated yield comparison for each variety. So we did just an irrigated comparison with these common beans. And you can see that the beefy resilient beans and Jim Meyer's selections, interspecies crosses, seem to do the best dry farmed. One thing to note was Whipple did particularly poorly this year compared to previous years. It usually would yield a little higher than Rockwell. And Marfax, being a determinate bean, finished early but didn't yield as much. Here we have these same varieties again, and it's graphed as percent of irrigated yield, the yield that's percent of irrigated, and we see that again, some of the breeding material did fairly better than others in terms of their relative dry farm yields. Hungarian rice bean only did particularly well because of its relative lack of irrigated yields. Another thing to note was dry farming. The average yield reduction of dry farming this last year was 50%. In other years, it would be, we've seen 60% or even 70% reduction. So this was a fairly good year and is partially a testament to these good varieties and breeding lines. So comparing common bean dry farm yields to Peppery bean dry farm yields, we see that on average, the Peppery beans yielded about 27% more than common beans based on the varieties that we trialed. And the top performing brown Peppery bean was the Sacaton brown. Top performing white bean was TAR's TEP 22. And then this black bean from Native Seed Search was the highest yielding black bean, although we have relatively little confidence on that because there was only a couple plots. So I know that was a fast presentation, and I'm going to share this presentation for people to view it at a slower pace. We have a lot to talk about, and I just wanted to mention that this year we want to continue dry farm dry bean variety trials, and we want to do that through seed linked because we don't have the resources for a full quantitative trials. So please sign up to participate for the 2021 dry farming trials with these bean varieties and possibly more. And we want to continue also selecting different bean varieties in dry farm conditions so we can have more of a resilient food staple in the Pacific Northwest.
If anybody has any questions for Lucas, you can feel free to enter those in the chat box.
Yeah, so far I haven't seen any in my own personal chat.
And you have on our bulletin board, you have a posting about maybe signing up for this trial. Is that right, Lucas?
Yeah, and I just entered that link into the chat as well. But yeah, you can go to the bulletin board and sign up, or click in the chat, just to stay in touch. All the details aren't fleshed out yet, but I'm just trying to see who's interested in trying more varieties. So Albert LePage asks what varieties could be best to grow, and that's a tough call. There's a lot of varieties out there. It seemed a lot of the varieties did fairly well. I'd say we have, in terms of our commercially available beans, Rosa de Luca was a standout variety, as well as Rockwell and Whipple. They do really well. And Zolfino, this white bean, did fairly well, although it was a later finisher. So you got to make sure you give it enough time to mature. And then, yeah, in terms of the Peppery beans, Sacaton Brown is the only, well-performing commercially available bean. But we're going to have all these varieties available for testing out this year in larger trials. So you can have access to some of our breeding lines, like the beefy resilient brown beans did really well. And in addition, some of these Peppery beans.